He had never been one to take much notice of his surroundings, especially inside the confines of his apartment, a one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a building that had no history, no rumors, no charm, just beige walls and slightly humming pipes. The light switch in his bedroom had always been to the left of the door, right where his hand naturally reached out after entering from the hallway. That was how it had been since he moved in, a small, simple certainty in an otherwise disjointed, unspectacular life. But then, one morning, it wasn't. He had awoken at 6:47 a.m., as always, the blinds closed, the dull warmth of his sheets still clinging to him. He sat up, stretched slightly, and instinctively glanced toward the door. And there it was, the light switch, but not where it should have been. It was still on the same wall, but further along, closer to the corner, just far enough to make his eyes pause. He frowned, stared at it, and tried to convince himself that perhaps his memory was faulty, that maybe it had always been slightly to the right and he had simply internalized a wrong version of the room layout. Still, as he got up and approached it, a disquiet settled in the space between his ribs. He reached out and pressed the switch. The lights came on. Nothing strange. Just a subtle but unmistakable relocation that his body recognized more than his thoughts could explain. That evening, he sat at his desk, scrolling through emails, but his mind wasn't on his work. It kept circling back to that switch. He even opened up photos on his phone, images he had taken of the room while unpacking, not for any meaningful reason, but to remember how he had placed his bookshelf. In those photos, the switch was indeed where he had always known it to be, close to the doorframe, almost brushing its edge. In the photo. Not now. He didn't tell anyone. Who would care? Who would even believe it? A moving switch. Not exactly the stuff of concern. Maybe the landlord had done some minor repairs. Maybe he was overthinking. He went to sleep a little later than usual, the memory of the photos tugging gently at the edge of his certainty. The next morning, he opened his eyes slowly and let them drift across the room. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at. Then it clicked. The switch had moved again. Not a lot, just a foot, maybe less, but now it was on the adjacent wall, directly to the right of the bed's headboard. It made no architectural sense. That wall had no wiring, no visible plate before. Yet there it was, seamless, flush with the paint, clean like it had always belonged there. He stared at it for several long minutes without moving. The only sound in the room was his own breathing, slightly heavier than usual, and the distant hum of his refrigerator through the closed door. He didn't move, didn't get up, didn't touch it. He just lay there, trying not to blink, afraid that doing so might make it worse, or worse, that nothing would change and this was simply reality now. When he finally got up, the switch worked, of course it did, the lights turned on with no delay, the same dull yellow wash of overhead fluorescence flickering for a moment before stabilizing. Everything else in the room remained untouched. The books were still stacked on the floor by his desk, the blinds were still half closed, the closet door still slightly ajar like he always left it. But the switch had moved, and now it was closer to the bed. He tried to rationalize again, as he did the first time. Maybe this was a prank. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe there had been a dream he couldn't quite remember. But none of those thoughts carried weight, they felt thin, like excuses dressed as explanations. By the fourth morning, the light switch had moved again. It now rested right beside the bed, within easy reach if he extended his arm while lying down. He hadn't touched it this time. He just stared, motionless, watching the blank white wall behind it, as if it might breathe or twitch or crack open to reveal some unseen mechanism, some hand at work. There was no crack, no indication of drywall damage, no smudge from previous placement. Just the switch, silently waiting, where it had never been before. Something had begun. He didn't know what. He wasn't sure if it was external, if it was mental, or if the room itself was subtly reordering him instead of the other way around. But now, each night before sleep, he turned off the lights without needing to leave the bed. And each time he reached out, his fingers touched the switch just a little bit sooner than the night before. The following days blended together into a slow, muffled drift, like time had sunk just below the surface of perception and was now moving silently beneath him, carrying him along whether he wanted it or not. He stopped checking the calendar. Meals became automatic. The outside world, with its routines and sounds and obligations, seemed dimmed, as though he were watching it from behind soundproof glass. But inside the room, things were not still. Not anymore. He began sleeping less, not out of fear, at first, but because something about the act of closing his eyes made him uneasy, like the moment he lost awareness, the room would shift again, and this time he might not wake up in the same position, or even the same place. And still, each morning without exception, the switch would be somewhere new. Always closer. Always wrong. No longer just a switch on a wall, now a presence, an anchor of attention. He started to avoid touching it, choosing instead to live in half-light, letting the dull morning haze seep through the blinds and do what it could to illuminate the increasingly unfamiliar space. One morning he awoke to find the switch mounted directly on the side of the bed frame, just inches from where his head lay. He did not react. He simply lay there, unmoving, watching it, knowing that if he reached out now, his fingertips would rest directly against it, that it had reached him, not the other way around. There was something too deliberate in its placement now, something that felt like a gesture, not malicious, but intimate, as if the room were not just shifting, but watching. Studying. Rehearsing. He started hearing things in the night. Nothing loud. Nothing sudden. But sounds that had no origin, a tiny creak in the wall just behind his head, a subtle vibration through the mattress that didn't match his breathing, the quiet rustle of fabric when he hadn't moved. Each sound small, ignorable on its own, but together they formed a pattern, like a code he hadn't yet learned to decipher. He began counting seconds between the sounds, whispering numbers to himself in the dark, trying to map out a rhythm. But it was inconsistent, deliberately so, like it wanted him to try. Then came the morning when the switch was gone. Not moved. Not broken. Simply absent. He woke to a bare strip of bed frame, no mark, no discoloration, just wood, like nothing had ever been mounted there. He checked the walls. The corners. The door. The closet. Even the ceiling. But there was no switch. No light. No mechanism. And when night fell, the room became completely dark, the kind of darkness that feels dense, where sound behaves differently, where silence has its own pressure, and space around you seems thicker than air. He lit a candle he didn't remember owning, and its flame flickered strangely, as if struggling against something heavier than mere draft. The shadows it cast moved in unexpected directions, elongating upward, pooling on the ceiling, refusing to sit still. The walls looked taller. The corners of the room seemed deeper, more distant than they should have been. And once, when he turned quickly toward the mirror above the desk, he caught a glimpse of his reflection not facing the same direction as him, but turning just a half-second late, as if it had just realized it was being watched. On the 7th day, he awoke not in bed, but standing, not upright, but leaning slightly forward in the center of the room, as if frozen in mid-step, arms stiff at his sides, feet bare against the cold floor. He didn't remember rising. He didn't remember falling asleep. And when he turned, slowly, he saw that the switch was back, but this time, in the middle of the wall directly in front of him, embedded within the surface of a full-length mirror that had never been there before. He approached the mirror, not because he wanted to, but because he had to, because the room itself had become directional, not just a container of space, but a system, a circuit, pulling him toward its core. As he stood before the mirror, he noticed the switch looked slightly wrong, the metal too dull, the screws too deep, the plate misaligned by just a few millimeters, not enough to notice consciously, but enough to unsettle the part of him that tracked such things without effort. He reached for it. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if in thick water. His fingers touched the switch. Cold. Dry. Familiar in shape, but somehow too quiet, like it had absorbed sound itself. He flipped it. Nothing happened. But in the mirror, his reflection did not move. It stood there, hands still raised, staring back at him with blank, deliberate stillness. And slowly, as he watched, the reflection began to smile, a slow, spreading expression, not cruel or kind, but knowing, and with it came the unmistakable understanding that he was no longer the one in control of his own perspective. That perhaps he was no longer inside the room at all, but within the logic of the room, inside the pattern that had slowly rewritten itself around him. Now, the mirror is all that remains. There are no walls, no corners, no switch. Only the reflection, always smiling, always waiting. And him, or whatever is left of him, staring back. Closer each time.